you allow me, I'm going to be introducing Sonia Magalhães from Brazil. Currently, she works with the education delegate of Brazil, of the Society of Jesus. Before that, she was national coordinator for the area of education in Brazil. And before that, she was rector of the Loyola School in Brazil for 5 years. From 1990, she's a member of the central team of the Association of Jesuit Schools in the central region of Brazil. Her PhD dissertation is precisely about model and educational methods. She's worked a lot on the coordination of educational teams and on project management, and she has specialized in curricular innovation on the basis of Ignatian pedagogy. So, Sonia, you have the floor. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I would also most especially like to welcome the people who are with us through the internet, because it's thanks to the participation of so many people in so many different places and regions of the world that in this room, that one would say 80 people fit, is even, well, crammed. And we have more than 1,000 persons every day with us. So obviously that makes all this reflection much more significant. So we are definitely not alone. And my thanks then to those accompanying us from places that are very far away. I have to say it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Father Peter McVerry, who is going to help us today. Father, please. He is going to help us today with the issue of the compassionate person. A warm welcome to Father Peter McVerry. Well, I'm just going to be very brief in the introduction because, of course, he will say and tell you much better about his life than I can. Well, Father McVerry was born in Ireland, and today he's going to be sharing with us not only his experience, but also, well, he was so good that he rewrote his presentation in order to connect better with what has been said in previous days. And that will also help us a lot. As I was saying, he was born in Ireland, his novitiate in 1960, and then from there he went on to study chemistry and maths in Dublin, and he taught during 2 years in a school, the Belvedere College, also in Ireland. From there, he started studying philosophy and theology. According to him, not finished, but he'll tell us about it. I won't go into any detail. And then he started working in the inner circle with the homeless people of Dublin, and he is still working with these people. So that is good work, intense work with a foundation that was started as a root foundation but became the Peter McVerry Trust to take care of the homeless persons. And with no further ado, I shall give the floor to Father McVerry. A pleasure.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Good morning, everybody. I'm not at all sure what I'm doing here. I'm probably the only person in the seminar who is not involved in any way in the formal educational structure. My only involvement in the formal Jesuit educational structure, as Sonia says, was I taught for 2 years. I taught chemistry and maths in Belvedere College, one of our schools in Dublin. Much to the relief of my students, I then moved on to theology and never returned to education. During my short time studying theology, I came across a child sleeping on the streets of Dublin, 9 years of age. That encounter changed my life forever. So 40 years later, we run 13 hostels in Dublin for homeless people, 3 for young people under 18. We have about 130 apartments. We have 4 drug treatment centres, and we have a drop-in centre, which is where I work. When people ask me how do I keep on working with homeless people all these years, my answer is, if I ever stopped, they might send me back teaching. I found this talk difficult to write because our schools are so diverse, from schools in very poor areas for very poor kids to schools in affluent areas for very rich kids. And also difficult because the educational structures within which our schools operate are so diverse, from schools that are totally funded and largely controlled by government to schools that receive no funding at all from government. Hence, I focus my reflections on the reality of Jesuit education in Ireland, the relevance of that to the situations, the diverse situations in which you find yourselves in as educators. You have to make that transfer yourselves. In Ireland, we have 5 secondary schools, second-level schools. 3 of them are fee-paying schools for mostly rich kids, though they have varying degrees of scholarship schemes for children who could never afford the fees. And 2 of our schools are free schools, open to anybody, funded by the government, but with a predominantly middle-class ethos, which makes it difficult for poorer children to feel comfortable there, even though theoretically it is open to them. So I'd like to begin this talk by sharing with you some of my experiences, as it provides the context for what I want to say. And also, we've been talking this morning about feelings, and it was emphasized how important feelings were to St. Ignatius. And we reflected for a few moments on the feelings that we experienced yesterday as we followed the path of St. Ignatius. And so in talking about my experiences, I want to talk about the feelings that I would like us as educators to instill in the students that we that we teach. I went to the inner city of Dublin, excuse me, to live in 1974, along with 2 other Jesuits. Why did we go there? We hadn't a clue. This was the era of General Congregation 32, which defined the mission of the society as the service of faith, of which the promotion of justice was an integral part. Now, we Jesuits in Ireland, we weren't exactly prominent in the justice field. Indeed, we were primarily associated with educating rich kids in our fee-paying schools. I was shocked by what I experienced in the inner city. The housing conditions were absolutely appalling. 8 families to a house, no soundproofing between apartments, 1 toilet in the yard at the back of the house, and a high concentration of families with problems often related to alcohol. But what shocked me even more was the fact that I had been living in Dublin for the previous 15 years, and I had no idea that people lived in such conditions within a 5-minute walk of the main street of the city. As Paul said on Monday, I was conscious of the conditions as I passed through that neighbourhood on a daily basis, but I had no consciousness of them until I went to live there. Working with homeless people over the past 40 years has totally and radically changed me. It has turned me inside out and upside down. It has challenged my values. It has made me very critical of the policies of our government. It has challenged my understanding of God, and it has changed my relationship to God. Listening to the stories of homeless children, stories of horrific abuse, violence, and extreme neglect, I came to a deep sense of gratitude to God for what I have received from God. I listened to a story of a 12-year-old boy living with his mother, who was an alcoholic and a mental health patient. He was living with his sister, and himself and his sister very attached to each other. And at 12 years of age, his mother stabbed his sister to death in front of him. He just left home. We don't know where he was for 5 years, sleeping on the streets of Dublin. Turned up at our door when he was 17. And he will live with us now for the rest of his life because he now has mental health problems. A young lad, 14 years of age, every time he went home, His mother slammed the door in his face and said, "Go away, you're not wanted here." Young lad, again 12 years of age, every morning before he went to school, he had to go into town, buy the heroin that his addicted mother needed for the day, and he had to come back and help her to inject it. Not surprisingly, by 15, he was injecting heroin, and he was homeless. Or a young 11-year-old child being sent out every night by his alcoholic parents into prostitution to bring back money so that they could have their drink. That changed my understanding of God and my relationship with God. I grew up being told that God was a judge, that God was up there looking down at us and noting down everything we did and said and even everything we thought. And someday you're going to have to go to God and account for it all. I don't believe in that God anymore. For me now, God is the giver of the gifts and has poured out and continues to pour out every day so many gifts on me. So my prayer to God is now simply thanks. Thanks for all that I have received and continue to receive, because there isn't anything else to say to God except thanks. People ask me, do I ever get depressed working with homeless people against the odds? And I say no. Never depressed, but always angry. I used to be an angry young man. Now I'm just an angry old man. I do about one funeral a month. It's usually a young person who has died from either an overdose or from suicide. We have 20,000 heroin users in Ireland. How many detox beds do we have for 20,000 heroin users? 35. And that's a disgrace. A couple of Christmases ago, I buried 2 young people. I knew them both very well. They both died of a drug overdose. One had been found dead on Christmas morning, and they were both on the waiting list for one of those 35 beds. But they didn't have time to wait, and we destroyed their lives. Could we eliminate homelessness in Ireland? Of course we could, but the political will isn't there. I tried to express my anger constructively by writing, by talking to groups, by talking in the media. I'd come back to the feeling of anger because I think we ought to be producing students who are angry. One of the many things they have taught me is what is the hardest part of being homeless. I always thought the hardest part of being homeless was not having a bed for the night, having to find a doorway or an abandoned building or something to sleep in. But it's not. You get used to that. What's the hardest part of being homeless? We had a young lad lived with us for a few years. When he was 18, he went on to live with his girlfriend. After about a year, they split up and he went on to the streets because he had nowhere else to go. After a couple of months in the streets, he threw himself into the River Liffey in the middle of Dublin. To his dismay, he was rescued and he was brought to hospital. And I went up to see him in hospital. He said, "Peter," he said, "I can't go on living like this." And I said to him, "What do you mean?" And he said, "I can't go on living knowing that nobody cares." And that's the hardest part of being homeless. To know if you disappeared off the streets of Dublin or Barcelona or Madrid or wherever, nobody would even notice you were gone. Your life has no meaning. It has no value to anybody else. You have totally lost any sense of your own value. You have totally lost your dignity. So when people ask me, what are we doing at homeless people? I say, yes, we can give some of them accommodation. We can give some of them drug treatment. We can give some of them counselling. But what we're really trying to do is to give them the message that they are just as important and just as valuable as anybody else. And if we are not giving them that message, we may as well pack up and go home because the rest isn't worth it. So forgive me for going on a little bit about homelessness when I'm supposed to be talking about Jesuit education. But I think its relevance to our educational efforts will become a little clearer as I go on. On Tuesday, we heard that before seeking to change the educational method in the network of schools in Barcelona, it was necessary to have a dream which would drive that process. I think Jesuit education is fundamentally the transmission of a dream, the dream that Jesus had. His dream was God's dream. And he dreamt of a world in which no one would be hungry and was not being given food, in which no one would be thirsty and was not being given water, in which no one would be naked and was not being given clothes, in which no one was in hospital and was not being visited, and in which no one was in prison and had been rejected by their community. He dreamed of a world where human beings could live together like God's family. In a family of 4, parents don't give 3 of the children a lovely big steak for their dinner and give the 4th child bread and jam. Yet that is what we, God's family, do to 1 billion people on our planet. In a family of 4, the parents don't give 3 of the children a nice comfortable bed for the night and tell the 4th child to sleep outside the front door on the porch. Yet that is what we, God's family, do to all the homeless people in every city in our world. This is not what God wants for God's children. I want our students to dream God's dream and to make it a reality in our world. I see dignity as the link between faith and justice. If I tell the students in our schools that every human being has the dignity of being a child of God, but if I am not struggling to make that dignity a reality in the lives of people whose dignity is denied or undermined by poverty, homelessness, or marginalization, then the words I'm speaking to our students are simply empty words, or even worse, hypocrisy. I think in the diversity of faiths and cultures with which those of you who are educators engage, as we talked about, I think on Monday, dignity is a concept that most of our students, of any faith or none, or whatever culture they come from, can identify with. We may not be able to demand that all our teachers and collaborators believe in God, still less in Jesus, but we can surely demand that they believe in the dignity of every human being. Many people of no faith are very committed to social justice and making our world a better place for all people. Perhaps they are what Karl Rahner calls anonymous Christians. Indeed, my experience is that most young people have a strong commitment to fairness and justice and will respond enthusiastically when asked to commit themselves to working for and with people on the margins, even if they have rejected the notion of God. Indeed, I have a difficulty with the word God. People often ask me, do I talk to homeless people about God? And I say no. And they look surprised. And they say, but you're supposed to be talking to them about God. You're a priest, aren't you? I say, look, I can't talk to them about God. Because when I use the word God, what do I mean? I mean a being who loves them with an infinite and a non-conditional love. When they hear the word God, what do they hear? They hear judgment, condemnation. And so we're using the same word God in 2 totally different and indeed contradictory senses. So I say I can't talk to them about God, but I hope we're communicating God to them. How do you communicate to somebody a God who loves them? Why, you do it by loving them, not by talking about it. We want to produce students who dream God's dream, committed to building a world of justice and peace in which everyone's dignity is affirmed and realized. We don't want to produce students who will fit into society. We want to produce students who will challenge and change the society they are in. Nor do we want to produce students who, as Pope Francis said, binds the wounds without first curing them and treating them, who treat the symptoms and not the causes and roots. That, says Pope Francis, is the temptation of the do-gooders, of the fearful, and also of the so-called progressives and liberals. We want to produce students who will go beyond raising money for good causes. In Ireland, there's a huge demand for Jesuit education. Parents know that their children will receive a very good education. They will almost certainly go on to college, get their degree, and fit very successfully into society as it exists. However, I would love if our Jesuit schools were places where most parents would not want to send their children, because they know that if they sent their child there, they would be opened to the dream, and they would receive a very strong grounding in social justice, both in theory and in practice, and in later life would be very active socially and politically. They would be pupils who would challenge and change society instead of fitting comfortably into it. They will be students who will probably be crucified by the society they are trying to change. Just as there were those who did not want Jesus' dream to become a reality and crucified him, today there are many in our world who do not want to share their wealth or power and will resist every attempt to make the world a more just place for those who are poor and marginalized. And those who attempt to do that will come up against those who oppose that change. In my original article, I used the Paradigm See Judge Act, and I'd like to expand that now in the light of the discussion, of the virtual discussion that has taken place since then. Some insertion experiences, the C. Some insertion experiences consist of doing something for the poor or homeless, or giving something to the poor or homeless. What Dan from the Philippines on Monday called poverty tourism, which most parents are delighted for their children to experience. The 15, 16-year-old students, many from Jesuit schools, who spend a week in our drop-in centre for homeless people, which I talked about in my original paper, they come in on a Monday morning wanting to know what can they do for these homeless people. As the week progresses, they come to realise that they have nothing to give these homeless people, but that these homeless people have so much to give them. They come in some small way to befriend them and not to see them as the recipients of their generosity. I think that's one of the desired outcomes of a good insertion experience, namely the realization that it is we who are not poor who have so much to learn and so much to receive from those who are poor. They challenge our prejudices. They break down the mental barriers that divide us. Those students come to realize during that short week that there is no them and us. There is only us. They make us angry that life has been so unfair and so unjust to people who are no different from ourselves, who have the same hopes and fears and joys and sorrows as ourselves. As Gaudium et Spes says, the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the followers of Christ. That anger can be the driving force for change, if expressed constructively. I think love and anger are two sides of the one coin. You cannot love someone who is suffering unnecessarily without being angry at what is causing the suffering. We want to produce students who are angry in a constructive way at the way things are. To produce students who are angry, we need teachers who are angry. And to have teachers who are angry, we need a headmaster or headmistress who is angry. Dan also talked on Monday about the need for insertion experiences to be sufficiently deep and sustained that our pupils can discover and experience that change is possible. And Arturo from Bolivia talked about insertion experiences where pupils can live what they are experiencing and live it to the limit. Most parents would demand that their children do not have such insertion experiences and would not send their children to a school that insisted on such experiences. Child spends about 15 to 20% of their year in the school environment and the other 80 to 85% at home. Unless the parents are supportive of a strong social justice dimension to the education of their child, then we are working against the parents, and the parents will inevitably win. where schools have the freedom to select the students they will accept? Is this commitment by parents to a demanding social justice experience for their children a primary criterion for the selection process? In the virtual discussion, the question was asked, was there such a thing as Christian compassion? I don't think so. I believe that compassion is a fundamental and spontaneous feeling that belongs to us as human beings. When we see a small child who's starving in her mother's arms, or a 9-year-old child living on the street, or a child bereaved through violence, our heart spontaneously reaches out to that child, whether we're Christians or Hindus or Muslims or Jews or atheists. But compassion must lead to action. If we care, that caring must make a difference. Otherwise, what is the point of caring? My problem with the term compassion is that compassion means different things to different people. For some, it can mean giving money to a charity at Christmas. For others, it can mean spending their life with Ebola patients in Africa. Compassion may or may not involve commitment. So I prefer the word solidarity. Prayed this morning that we would produce men and women not so much for others, but men and women with others. Compassion is a spontaneous response of the heart. But the plight of those to whom our hearts reach out spontaneously in compassion must be reflected upon. It is the actions which result from that reflection which are the expression of true compassion. An analogy is sometimes used. Imagine a person sitting beside a lake, beside a river on a beautiful sunny day. They're enjoying the peace and the quiet and listening to the flow of the river. And the next minute, a body comes floating down the river. They jump in, they pull the body out, give them the kiss of life, revive them, send them on their way. Truly an act of compassion. They settle down to enjoy the rest of the day, and a second body comes floating down the river, and a third body, and they jump in and pull them out and give. Eventually, at some stage, they must say, I must go up and see where all these bodies are coming from. And so they go up the river and they find a bridge, and an oil tanker has crashed, spilt the oil, broken the side of the bridge, and everybody walking across the bridge slips down the river. So what does he do? He cleans up the bridge and puts a big rope along the side of the bridge, and there are no more bodies floating down the river. Pulling the bodies out of the river is what Mother Teresa did so wonderfully. A magnificent witness to the compassion of God. And it's what we often do in our social insertion experiences. But fixing the bridge is what Oscar Romero tried to do. He challenged the structures of his society, which kept people poor and marginalized, and like Jesus and many others, he was murdered. So I prefer the word solidarity to the word compassion. We are striving to produce students who are in solidarity with the poor and the marginalized. What's the difference? Ireland is a very compassionate country. People will give very generously to services working with homeless people. Indeed, our work depends on the generosity of such people. But if we try to open a hostel for homeless people in their neighbourhood, those same people may be out on the picket line trying to prevent it. In my original paper, I tried to describe how I see the difference between compassion and solidarity. Compassion suggests giving charity to the poor, either in the form of money or time. Solidarity, on the other hand, suggests working for justice for the poor, as defined by Pope John Paul II, when he said, solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortune of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. Reflection then is an integral part of the insertion experience. Reflection moves us from compassion, spontaneous feeling of distress, to solidarity. A good insertion experience will produce in the student a feeling, it is good for us to be here. But unless adequately reflected upon, insertion experiences can be transitory and forgettable, as the it is good for us to be here feeling fades or is pushed aside by other more pressing demands, such as the pressure of exams. Without reflection, an insertion experience can sometimes even reinforce a student's prejudices. In life, we often internalize unjust structures so that we are totally unaware of the injustice of those structures. In the United States in the 18th century, good, God-fearing, church-going people owned slaves. Hopefully, in compassion, they treated their slaves kindly, but the institution of slavery had become embedded in their consciousness in such a way that many of them never questioned the injustice of it. A deep insertion experience can leave students confused and challenged as they come face to face with unjust structures which they may have internalized. They may have therefore justified those structures without ever realizing the injustice in them. To reflect adequately on those experiences requires teachers who also dream the dream. I gave a real example in my original paper of a student from a Jesuit school who had a deep insertion experience. But his attempt to reflect on it with his teachers not only failed, but was ridiculed by teachers who had not dreamed the dream that he was beginning to experience. The key then to producing students who dream the dream is to have teachers who dream the dream. Teachers who will inspire, provoke, and accompany students who are beginning to dream that dream. They too then, the teachers, must be prepared to engage in such insertion experiences, perhaps even with their students, if they have already not had that experience. This is a huge challenge for any school whose primary requirement is for teachers who are competent to teach. Key to having teachers who dream the dream is to have a principal who dreams the dream and can build an ethos around a corporate commitment to justice. Unless the principal or headmaster or headmistress is actively promoting and supporting a process of insertion and reflection, then the process is probably going to fail. And principals are usually appointed by a board, mostly of lay people. When appointing principals, there are other qualifications required, such as being a good administrator, which may come to dominate the selection process. To ensure that a school has a continuity of principals who are committed to a social justice dimension in education, the vision, the values and mission statements of that school must clearly state the social justice dimension as one of its primary priorities. We heard on Monday of a school where these are discussed with the board and teachers every year. To produce students who are in solidarity with the poor also requires, obviously, our schools to work with parents. As you know better than I, unless the parents are supportive of the aims and objectives of the school, then a school which is creating students with a strong social justice commitment may be setting up conflict between the student and their parents, which may leave the student very confused and may be unfair to the student. Reflection then on the insertion experience will focus students on challenging the economic, social and political structures of our societies which create and maintain gross and often growing inequalities, poverty and homelessness. It may challenge the values and mindsets of their parents, so we cannot leave them out of the process. But it may also challenge the very nature of the school itself, which despite scholarship schemes and social justice programs, may itself be maintaining and contributing to the social and economic inequalities and injustice. I believe our Jesuit fee-paying Jesuit schools in Ireland, as they currently exist, are maintaining and reinforcing the inequalities and injustices that exist in Irish society. The ultimate insertion experience for students is to be educated in a school where students from all social backgrounds can sit together in the same classroom and can befriend and learn from each other. A friendship which can lead to action for and with those who are most disadvantaged. And so to action. Reflection on the insertion experience, if done in some depth, will inevitably lead to a desire to do something to bring about change. We tend to consider action as something that can be postponed to the future, after the students graduate and get settled into their career. Understandably, as students, their primary focus is on their educational attainments, so their opportunity to get involved in action outside the school is necessarily limited. I think the test as to whether a school has an ethos which considers the promotion of justice to be an integral part of its educational responsibility is whether the school is committed to the promotion of justice within the school. My dream is for a school that would encourage and promote student committees, composed of students of all ages, who have the responsibility to identify and address issues of injustice and unfairness within the school. Perhaps that injustice is bullying of some students by other students, or alleged unfair treatment of a student by a teacher. My dream is for a school which encourages students to take action, even radical action, to redress the unfairness which they expose. I hear a gasp of horror from school principals here. I was delighted to hear of a school in Australia with a student union who were upset that they were not consulted about having to start the school day 5 minutes earlier so that the examen could be got in. Our desire is not just to produce students who are radical social activists. The difference between radical social activists and the students we produce is that the students we produce are motivated not by ideology, but by their experience of being loved by God with an infinite and a non-conditional love, and feel called to follow the risen Jesus in the building of the family of the kingdom of God. They wish to give their lives not for a left-wing ideology, but for a person. The spiritual exercises have an important role to play in producing teachers or students of solidarity, provided the exercises are given a social context, which today would be very different from the time of Ignatius. The first week could help us to reflect on our prejudices, our complacencies, our inaction, and failure to respond to the social injustices around us, what today we call social or structural sin. In the kingdom meditation, we commit to following Jesus in bringing the kingdom of God to reality, a kingdom in which all human beings can live together as a family under God's rule. The two standards challenge the justifications and the rationalizations which we invent to avoid leaving our comfort zones. The three classes of people challenge us to reflect on where we stand in the struggle to bring dignity to everyone. And the third week brings home to us the likely outcome of our commitment to justice. We will be outsiders in the world in which we are growing up, a world which will oppose us to the end. And the fourth week, along with the contemplation for obtaining love, roots us in the firm foundation stone from which we can go forth to build a world filled with justice, namely the belief that we are loved infinitely and unconditionally by God, with a love which nobody and nothing can take away or diminish even by one iota. We want to produce students who, from a deep experience of the love of God, an experience which is mediated to them by the love of others, are willing to commit their lives to building a more just world. On Monday, George defined the formation of conscience as a process which leads and helps the learner to find meaning in their own life and enables them to find an answer to the quest for transcendence. How do we do that? I'm often asked by young people, how do you know if God exists? I say to them, I'll tell you. I'll tell you how you can know whether God exists or not. Imagine a person sitting on a riverbank on a beautiful sunny day again, enjoying the peace and the quiet. And beside that person is a little child playing on the riverbank. And the next moment the child falls into the river. And the person at the riverbank jumps in, pulls them out, saves their life. What will the parents do? Well, of course, the first thing they will do is they will go to hospital to reassure themselves that their child is okay. What will they do next? Next, they will look to find you. They will want to find you to thank you for saving their child's life. So I say to young people, you want to know if God exists? Do not stand there looking up into the clouds, for you will not find God there. Look around you. Look around you at the suffering of those around you and reach out and try to take some of that suffering off their shoulders. And what will God do? God will want to find you. God will want to thank you for reaching out to God's children. And when God finds you, then you will meet God. And then you will know that God exists. It is in reaching out to those around us who are poor and unwanted that our students will discover the meaning of life and will come to find the answer to the quest for transcendence. Our students will not find God in our chapels, and they will not hear God in their prayers, in their praying and their singing, unless they have first found God and heard God in the suffering of the people around them. The banks in Europe have recently undergone stress tests to see if they meet the criteria of being a bank. I often wonder, should we do some such test on Jesuit schools and colleges? We need to continually ask the question, given all the money, the manpower, and the effort which we expend on our educational apostolate, are we happy that this investment is producing people of faith who are committed to the following of Jesus in his solidarity with the poor and in his passion for justice? Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Padre McVeary.
Thank you, Father McVeary. As was the case of other days, before we go on to the discussion session, we're going to be spending a couple of minutes for each one to analyze notes, and in order to see out of all that Father McVeary has shared with us, what is it that moved us the most? And then after that, yet another minute or another couple of minutes to share with those next to us. And then after, we go to the discussion session. So a personal moment now, and then I'll tell you when we can speak to each other.
lo que quieran que...
So now do share. We have a couple of minutes for you all to talk to each other, and then we'll go on to the discussion session.
Muy bien.
Okay. So this was only to just get ready. Now, following our schedule, we'll be having half an hour in order to start the conversation, because remember, we have the whole of the day to deal with the compassionate person subject. So don't think you only have half an hour to talk about this. Not at all. It's the first half hour to talk about this, and then we continue. Jose Alberto threatened you with this, so I'm going to threaten you as well. I'm a good timekeeper as well. So 3 minutes per person. We have half an hour. So that means 10 people at the most. Okay? So don't go on for more than 3 minutes if possible. Okay. The 5 first people who have any remark, please. Carlos, Vilma, Father Ben, Joe, and Mauricio. Okay. Carlos.
Father Peter. My name is Carlos. It will be in English on this occasion. First, I want to call your attention to your own presentation. It's somehow an awkward presentation. No PowerPoint. Few concepts. The title, you promised to talk about compassionate person. Now you talk about solidarious person. And yet, it's been deeply educative. Man, you have something to tell us. And has nothing to do with means of communication. I found it very moving, poignant. It's a strong presentation. And I say it's moving because it moved me to tears, affections. I talked about prophetic speech 2 days ago, and this is one of the kind. You seem to know what God wants. And I want to hear more about that. If my Father Provincial would ask me to come and follow you, I would, happily. So this is not a cherry on top of a cake. This is the very fabric of the dough. Thank you.
Gracias, Carlos.
Thank you, Carlos. Vilma. I'm sorry, her microphone seems to be off. Vilma, yes? When our chairperson was telling us to look at our notes in order to think personally and see how this had got to us, really, I don't have even 1 page of notes. And I thought it wasn't more than a page. Why? Well, because this has been a presentation that's so deep, so much based on experience, it's so moving. And first of all, because Father Peter is making us understand compassion not from an intellectual approach, not from the intellectual conceptual tenets, but rather he has conveyed to us his own experience of what compassion is. And I am really moved because I think it's not only that one has to have an understanding of suffering, but rather one has to experience the suffering of the other. One has to be able to perceive the suffering of the other. One has to have the burden of the other, be in charge of the other. And that makes us have a different approach to compassion, different to what our schools have right now. And I have a question. Our schools, our colleges have very important social action programs. But I thought that compassion starts with the heart. First, one has to work on the heart. One has to cultivate this inner self, something that we did on the first day, so that after the heart can go on to fighting in a sublime manner as to what really suffering means. And Father Peter was telling us it's not ideology. It's just from a deep experience of God. I am very moved and very thankful. Thank you. Thank you, Vilma. Father Joe now, and then over there. Yeah, no, that's okay. Yeah, Joe, then Father Joe. Please, yeah, the fourth.
Father Joseph Carver from the United States. Peter, I thank you for this presentation, because it is a deep reminder that so often in our schools we stop simply at charity and we do not work toward the structural change of justice. And we call the work that we do in our schools the charitable work or the immersion programs. This is our social justice commitment, and it isn't justice at all. It is simply charity. I also appreciate your sort of identifying yourself as a sort of contrarian voice, because I believe that those are the voices precisely that we need on the boards of directors of our schools, so that we place our boards and our schools in tension and that we do not need to fear the tension that we have, because we all know those voices in our own communities that are like Father Peter's voice, voices that call us to the constituent element of justice that the general congregations have called us for. So I would encourage us as schools and as apostolic ministries of the Society of Jesus not to be afraid to welcome those voices onto our boards, because they will place us in a healthy tension where we can discern how to go forward. If our boards do not have voices of dissent, then we will not be able to discern the invitation of the Spirit.
Gracias, Joe. Ahora sí.
Thank you, Joe. Father Ben now.
For the Philippines. Thank you also, Peter, very, very much. What reminded me is a work I do with an organization in the Philippines called Gawad Kalinga to offer care. It was founded by an alumnus. He went in 1995 to live in the biggest squatter community in the Philippines, 700,000 people with criminals, drug addicts, everything. And he lived there with his daughters. And he was transformed, and he found his way slowly to build this organization that builds homes, families, and communities for the poor. I have worked with them since 2000, and the experience with them has transformed many of our students. I'll share a couple tomorrow in experience. The challenge we face now is to find out what works. In other words, we have reached a point where many are inspired, but what really works in transforming structures? What really works in improving the life of the poorest of the poor? What really works in connecting the people at the top to those in the bottom? Because you need both. So I hope that somewhere along the way we can share experiences of what you find works. I'll share our experience of what works. I have a research group that is studying that precisely, finding out what really works and how to expand them. Because we can talk about justice and injustice, but what really works? It's good to be angry, but I've been angry sometimes in the 70s, but you realize that being angry still has to be transformed into effective action. Thank you.
Gracias, Father Ben.
Thank you, Father Ben. Mauricio. Mauricio Garcia from Colombia. First of all, I would like to thank Peter for his presentation. Indeed, it is very moving. I have, on the basis of listening to the presentation, some questions about the experiences that we all live in our schools, particularly in Colombia. First, I think we have to go beyond making people aware. We have to go beyond the fact of getting our students to know that there are poor people and that there are difficult situations in the context in which they live. And there, yes, I do think we have made headway. We have made great progress. However, as Peter himself was telling us, one has to make and live an experience of deep insertion. One has to make sure that the experience really goes deep into the heart. And there we have a kind of coverage problem, the difficulty of having and organizing such experiences. How do you organize it for 1,800 or 2,000 students that we have in some of our schools? And that is a daunting thing to do, because to the extent that experiences become larger and deeper, in many cases, well, maybe they lose in depth, precisely because if you want to get to more students, you're going to be losing depth. And it has to be deep and sustainable experiences that we should look for, but it's very difficult to get that with many people. You can only work on this kind of experience with small groups of students. So that is another type of tension that in Colombia, at least, we encounter in our experience. Another thing is how to go to the structural side of things. I think that there is a work in advocacy that is so important. It is essential to develop this kind of work. It's important to prepare our students so that they can, at a given point in time, later on in their lives, have a greater influence on social problems in their societies, social problems that are happening in our countries and that demand challenges and different types of responses. But we really all have a lot to say and do. Thank you, Mauricio. Now, for the second round, I have Arturo after Javier, Father George. I forgot your name. Yeah, 4 and 5 over here. Yeah, and then we continue. First, Arturo. Arturo, a Jesuit from Bolivia.
A ver, yo quisiera...
I would, more than just, let me see, in the second week of the exercises, in other dynamics, in other weeks, there is what I was mentioning the other day, the affectionate models. Father Arrupe said very often that one should always have experiences with the poor in a definite manner, in such a way that having been with the poor or having not been would be the huge difference. And one has to let oneself be evangelized by the poor in such a way that the reality of the poor is not only something that one can get to know and see, but that one can suffer. It should hurt me in a way that reality of the poor would modify my life, would modify the way I talk, would modify and change the way I opt for things. It would change the way I act, the way I live, the way I go for options all the time. Saint Ignatius talked a lot about the inner knowledge, or the knowledge of oneself. And in the second week, he talks about redemption. My question for you, Father Peter, is more or less in that direction. Something that maybe we're not dealing with enough. In what way education in the society, how the schools of the Society of Jesus can take on the challenge of creating and modifying public policies of injustice, even in education. Education that in many places is a tool for inequality, a tool of exclusion. Even in the Society of Jesus, in its schools, because it means different opportunities and different means. So how to make sure that this kind of international policies and organizations within the Society of Jesus takes on board the issue of social justice in education. Thank you. Javier? Yes, as is the case of all of you, I'm sure. I mean, I feel really moved. Thank you for your presentation. I was thinking especially on how I think that the problem of our schools is the separation we have. On the one hand, we have all that is academic, and on the other hand, we have the pastoral issues. And then separately, we have the social commitment programs. And very often, this is not interconnected. I think that Peter McVerry is well, he said it repeatedly. If educators don't have a commitment, a specific commitment, it's very difficult that this works. Even in his presentation, he's telling us about it all the time. So I think that our main aim here should be to reflect on how to reconnect everything once again, how to go to the crux of the things, to the deep heart of the matter, difficult to translate, but to the very center, the marrow of the bone. We don't have to look for change outside. We don't have to look for more social commitment activities, but rather we have to rethink our process of teaching and learning in such a way that it does not dissociate any longer, so that in the DNA we have the student, so that we make sure that our students are critical, and we make sure that they have the ability, if we contextualize the curriculum into real problems of the persons that do not have, then we would make sure that our students would be persons able to act. And educators would interact with students in specific projects, and they would look for creative solutions. And then, yes, indeed, those experiences would be specific. But let us not dissociate. I think one of the problems in our case in the Society of Jesus is the dissociation of the 4 C's. Thank you, Javier. Father George.
Thank you, Father Peter, for your very inspiring sharing about your experience and an analysis of our education, the Jesuit education that we are trying to provide. Certainly, I do believe that we need to have programs where we are able to develop our students into compassionate people or people who are with a deep sense of solidarity with those who are marginalized, underprivileged, those who are treated unjustly. But I feel after GC 32, there has been a feeling that some Jesuit schools are not in line with the charism of the Society of Jesus. In the sense, some of us are trying to do what the society is supposed to be doing, and some of us are not doing. I think that is not the way we need to proceed further. Just to give an example or to connect with what we are talking about day before yesterday, when we talked about that we need change in our schools, we talked in a particular context. But today I would like to reiterate that we need to change the ethos of our school, not by segregating people who have and who have not. Because sometimes I feel, and I have seen it, I have experienced it, an affluent person who is in a mansion, at times he also is homeless. Because he feels the lack of care, he feels the lack of love. And I think that is where we need to hit when we are in a situation of that kind. Not by segregating people, we are not here, or neither am I saying that, we need to do this, What I'm saying is this aspect of being compassionate, being in solidarity, it should not become an additional program in our schools, but just the way we spoke about competence day before yesterday, this also should become an integral part of every activity in the school. That's what I would suggest. Thank you.
Gracias, Padre Jorge.
Thank you, Father George. Now, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I feel invited to reflect more and more about the transformation of the phrase of Father Arupi by Father Kolvenbach, men and women for others, to men and women for and with others. It is not only a change of words, but a real conversion in our way to act. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Position has made me introspect, and I begin to wonder, experience is one of the components of Ignatian pedagogy. How this experience in the context of the curriculum, the structured curriculum, can be converted into insertion experience. Point 2, whatever learning, teaching that takes place in the classroom situation, how that can help students to become more sensitive, so that becoming sensitive, how they can become proactive, so that they don't limit themselves only to charity, to please themselves, but go beyond charity, that is, showing their solidarity with people in action.
Bueno,
Well, now, as I'm the chairperson, I'm sorry, I have to organize the few 8 minutes we have left before the break, and I should give voice as well to a certain diversity of representation, because we have already had many interventions coming from Latin America and Asia, 2 from Europe, 1 from North America, and then after I want Father McRae to have at least 3 minutes, because he's taking notes here, so I'm sure he wants to share what he's thinking with us, and he should have 5 at least, yes, because he's listening to us all. So, come on, 1, 2, and 2, yeah, 3, 4. You start, and then we come here. Okay? The person, and then you, yeah. Yes, you have the microphone. You start, yes.
Irish province. I'm the education delegate, and I feel I should resign at this particular moment in time. You imagine how easy it is to work with this guy in the province. Yeah. Peter, as always, you're inspirational and prophetic and extraordinarily challenging. I remember in the 80s when Men for Others was really current in the schools and people were really fired up. And a lot of the changes that took place within our fee-paying schools happened then. Actually, some of them had happened in the 70s with the Crescent and Galway and so on. And lots of people in the schools in the 80s were very angry and very keen on change. But what I've detected over the last 20 years, 30 years, within the Jesuits in Ireland, but I suspect right across the world, is a deep ambivalence towards the colleges. Some, like yourself, are very, very critical. Others are deeply attached to them as they are. And it's very hard, when you're living with that ambivalence, to have an unambiguous direction, a very clear sense of a call to arms in the way that you're calling us to. I would really welcome the kind of clarity, the kind of urgency that you're proposing for us. And I hope that comes out of this gathering.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Peter. Undoubtedly, the Spirit is here with us today. In my case, just the same as everybody else, I am profoundly moved, profoundly affected by this. My task, typically, is to be in charge of leadership, the leadership of our educators, of our directors, and today I have to tell you all that I've changed. I have changed. I know that these are very obvious things, but sometimes obvious things waken you up all of a sudden, as though you fell from a horse. It's like a jolt. Leadership in the classroom, leadership in education is not the typical leadership. It is a totally different category. It's not really that I'm against it. It's just, it just overcomes all this. When a teacher is in a classroom, the teacher is not only leading issues that have to do with the homework or the assignment or the organization or the stimulus or with getting the students to learn, mastering the subject. No. It's moral leadership. It's a leadership that transcends us because it focuses on the person. It doesn't focus on the task. And because it focuses on the person, then it goes on to this different dimension. It goes on to a dimension that essentially deals with values, but dealing with values in the classroom. And it deals with values, not making the conscience become something mute, something that God talks to, but rather helping students in a personal and collective transformation within the classroom, okay? So not only personal transformation, but collective transformation. And this is done with the inspiration of a transcendence. And this is something to be practiced. And the leader in the classroom, the teacher in the classroom, has to be a person inspiring trust. He or she has to be ready to give and ready to make students trust the educator. And this is a radical change. So I am fully committed now to change my vision. Thank you very much, Father. Thank you.
Thomas from Cameroon. The first thing that struck me in what Father Peter said is the concept of talking of God and communicating God. And that will be very difficult in my context because I know if even if the person is poor and even if the person is on the street, because we have many street kids, they would like you to talk to them about God first and then communicate God, because this goes together. I think maybe it's because this concept of God like a judge seems like not the first conception of God for our people. That's what I think. And it was difficult for me to follow the presentation because from the beginning, it's just brought me back to my context and raising in me many questions. So even if apparently we don't have homeless people, so how can we understand that these street kids are a problem for tomorrow? Because our students fear these street kids. So even for today, they don't want to have any contact with them. They don't want to think that these are good people that we can help. So this is a big challenge for us in our schools. And so your presentation just brought in my mind many questions that I think we are challenged to know how to face these realities of street kids and poor people for today. Thank you.
Gracias, Thomas. Y ahora vamos a hacer los...
Thank you, Thomas. And now what we're going to do is as follows. I'll remind you. Remember, when we come back, we have 2 experiences and then further time for discussion here. Then this afternoon, we have the same schedule before the group work. So people who didn't get the chance to share thoughts and questions now can do so in the second and third discussion sessions of the room. But I wouldn't like to finish the first session of the day without giving Father McVery the 5 minutes he requires at least to comment. So you have the floor, and I apologize for the short time. 5 minutes you have.
Where's me gone? Yes. Thank you very much. There was so much there, I obviously couldn't respond to it all. So let me just pick up 1 or 2 points that I have circled here. Dan asked what works in changing structures. I think that is really a very, very key question. Very obviously, it's a very, very key question. I'm not the person to answer it. When I started working with homeless people, there were 1,000 homeless people in Ireland. Today, there are over 5,000. So I haven't been very successful in changing structures. But I think it is really a key question. A related question to that was, how do our schools take on the task of changing public policy? And I think the answer to that is witness. It's primarily witness. And for me, when Jesus brought in the kingdom of God, he wanted the kingdom of God to replace the kingdom of Herod that people were living in. And how was he going to do that? Jesus didn't set up a political party. He didn't set up a lobby group to get at Herod. He set up a community that would be a witness to a whole new way of living, which would replace the way of living in the kingdom of Herod. So I think our schools have to be witnesses if we are to change public policy. If they are not witnesses, then those who try to change public policy, it will be thrown back in their face. Well, look at your schools. The question of how can we provide deep insertion experiences for 1,800 or 2,000 students? We can't. So what do? I think the insertion experience should ideally be within the classroom. Said that during the talk. I couldn't be prescriptive. Situations differ so much around the world. But I think if I were Father General, I would give schools 10 years to become socially integrated or close. I think the day of educating, how can we take privileged children, give them a privileged education, and expect them to go out and have a concern for the poor, no matter what social justice programs we have. And since we cannot offer to a large number of pupils a deep insertion experience, I think we have to bring that deep insertion experience into the school and into the classroom where people can befriend. I know in Ireland, in Belvedere College, we have a scholarship program, and there was one child there who was a traveller child. Now, for those of you who don't know, our traveller, not quite gypsy, but the nearest thing to a gypsy in other parts of the world. And he was brought in on a scholarship program. And during the year, he stood up in front of the class and he said, you know, he said, I'm a traveling child. And he talked about his life as a traveling child. And he got a huge round of applause from all the other children. So I think we have to bring the deep insertion experience into the classroom, because we cannot get all our children out into a deep insertion experience. Learning we can't teach social justice. We can only witness to it. Students will not follow a teacher, but they will follow a witness. And I think if our teachers are witnesses to social justice and the commitment to social justice in their own lives, in their own actions, then the pupils will learn from the teachers about social justice, but only if they are our witnesses. I think that's all that I would want to say at this time.
Muchísimas gracias. Yo creo.
Thank you very much indeed. I think now, and it's a good idea that we do it, we have a break. And we'll come back to this room at 11:11, sorry, not so long, no. 11:15, we meet again in the room to continue with the experiences. So thank you very much indeed for Peter. Thank you.